November 24, 1944. Easley Field, Saipan. Mariana Islands Lieutenant Colonel Robert K. Morgan eased forward the throttles of his B-29 Superfortress Dauntless Doi, heading a formation of 110 aircraft from the 73rd Bomb Wing bound for Tokyo. The instruments before him narrated a truth the Japanese High Command refused to accept. The Turbo-Supercharger boost indicators climbed steadily, sustaining sea-level power at altitudes where enemy fighters struggled for oxygen. On this day, these silver giants would display a technological supremacy Japan could not offset. Hidden within each engine sat twin General Electric Turbo-Superchargers, devices destined to prove more decisive than any cannon or bomb. These mechanisms, harnessing exhaust gases to compress intake air, enabled the massive Wright R-3350 engines to sustain 2,200 horsepower at heights nearing 32,000 feet. Japanese fighters, optimized for maneuverability at mid-altitudes, labored to reach such elevations. Their engines, lacking efficient high-altitude supercharging, lost power dramatically in the thin atmosphere. This was the first B-29 assault on Tokyo from the newly captured Marianas bases, barely 1,500 miles from Japan's capital. Unlike earlier operations launched from remote Chinese fields, these bombers could strike consistently and return intact. The pressurized cabins allowed crews to breathe normally while Japanese pilots wrestled with primitive oxygen systems that often failed at great heights. As Morgan's bomber ascended into the morning sky, trailed by more than 100 others, the technological gulf between American and Japanese aviation became unmistakable. 5 months earlier, on June 15, 1944, the first B-29 strategic bombing sortie against Japan had departed from Chengdu, China. 75 superfortresses took off that evening, though only 47 reached their primary objective at Yawata on Kyushu. The mission revealed both the B-29's promise and the obstacles ahead. 7 aircraft were lost, 1 shot down over the target, 1 destroyed on the ground after an emergency landing, and 5 in operational mishaps. 57 airmen perished. Yet, even this costly beginning exposed Japan's defenses as inadequate against high-altitude bombers. Japanese radar crews on Kyushu detected the incoming formation, and air raid sirens wailed across Yawata. Pilots of the Imperial Army's 4th Sentai scrambled to their Kawasaki Ki-45 Toryu twin-engine fighters, climbing aggressively toward bombers cruising between 8,000 and 21,000 feet. Even at these relatively moderate altitudes dictated by fuel limits on the long route from China, Japanese interceptors struggled. Their Nakajima Hei-25 engines, rated at 1,080 horsepower each, lacked effective turbo-supercharging. Above 20,000 feet, these engines produced barely 60% of rated power. Warrant Officer Sadamitsu Kimura managed to close in on one B-29, an aircraft designated Limber Dragon, carrying 12 crew members. His assault succeeded, sending the Superfortress down in flames with no survivors. But the victory came at dreadful cost. Kimura expended nearly all his ammunition and barely limped back to base with his engine overheating dangerously at altitude. Around him, other Japanese pilots fired desperately at the gleaming bombers, but most attacks failed to inflict meaningful damage. The B-29's defensive turrets, guided by advanced fire control systems, retaliated with lethal precision. Captain Teruhiko Kobayashi, of the Imperial Army's 244th Sentai, one of Japan's most accomplished fighter leaders, later documented his unit's frustration. American bombers operated at heights where Japanese aircraft could scarcely maintain level flight, much less maneuver effectively. The B-29's speed, about 350 meters at altitude, matched what Japanese interceptors could achieve in thin air above 25,000 feet. Simply reaching bombing height consumed excessive fuel, reducing ammunition loads and driving engines to temperatures verging on catastrophic failure. The key to American dominance lay in technology Japan had investigated but never mastered. General Electric's Type B turbo-supercharger for the Wright R-3350 engine represented engineering brilliance. Each B-29 engine carried two of these devices, using hot exhaust gases to spin turbines exceeding 20,000 revolutions per minute. The turbines drove centrifugal compressors, forcing air into the intake manifolds at pressures equal to sea level, even at 30,000 feet. The concept was elegant. Waste exhaust energy, instead of being expelled uselessly, performed valuable work compressing intake air. This enabled efficient combustion at altitudes, where ordinary engines suffocated. Each turbo-supercharger added roughly 150 pounds per engine installation, but delivered performance equivalent to doubling engine capacity. Without them, the B-29 would have been just another heavy bomber, vulnerable to interception, and unable to exploit altitude as a shield. Japan had begun experimenting with turbo-supercharging as early as 1941, when engineers at Nakajima Aircraft Company examined captured foreign documents and obtained sample units through clandestine channels before America entered the war. Japanese designers recognized the immense advantage such devices offered. Yet, despite 3 years of effort, Japan never fielded turbo-supercharged fighters in any significant quantity. The reasons highlighted the vast industrial gulf between Japan and the United States. Turbo-superchargers demanded metallurgical expertise beyond Japan's reach. Turbine wheels endured exhaust temperatures surpassing 115 feet and 100 degrees, while spinning at velocities generating centrifugal stresses of several thousand pounds per square inch. Any metal imperfection caused catastrophic turbine failure. American manufacturers like General Electric possessed metallurgical expertise, precision forging equipment, and quality control systems to produce reliable turbines. Japanese industry, stretched thin by war demands, could not match these standards. Lieutenant Fumio Nia were an engineering officer who evaluated captured B-29 components later in the war, documented findings that survived in Japanese archives. Examining a turbocharger removed from a crashed B-29 in China, NIA marveled at American manufacturing precision. Turbine blades were machined to tolerances measured in thousandth of an inch, balanced so perfectly that units spun at maximum speed without vibration. High-temperature alloys used in turbine construction exceeded anything Japanese industry produced. Even bearings designed to operate in extreme heat while maintaining precise alignment represented manufacturing capabilities Japan did not possess. More devastating was the systematic nature of American turbocharger production. General Electric's Schenectady, New York plant manufactured thousands monthly, each meeting exacting specifications. Production lines incorporated automated testing equipment, verifying performance of every unit before installation. Defective components were identified and rejected before reaching operational aircraft. Japanese attempts at turbocharger production yielded perhaps dozens monthly. With reliability so poor, most failed after few operational hours. By August 1944, Japanese intelligence compiled disturbing reports about American bomber capabilities. Interrogation of captured B-29 crewmen, wreckage analysis, and pilot observations painted a picture of technological superiority that shocked military leaders. The B-29 was not simply a large bomber. It was a flying weapons system incorporating innovations Japan could not match. Colonel Takushiro Hattori, an operations officer at Imperial General Headquarters, wrote in his diary that month about implications of B-29 raids. American bombers operated with impunity at altitudes Japanese fighters could not effectively reach. The few interceptors managing engagement reported that even when scoring hits, the B-29's rugged construction absorbed damage that would destroy Japanese aircraft. Most alarming was realization that these raids represented only the beginning. American production capabilities suggested thousands of B-29s would eventually attack Japan, each one beyond effective defensive reach. Thematics of interception had turned catastrophically against Japan. A fighter climbing from ground level to 30,000 ft consumed perhaps 30 minutes and burned 1/3 of its fuel load. At altitude, fighter performance degraded dramatically. Guns, while deadly at close range, required pilots to close within a few hundred ft of targets, a maneuver made nearly impossible by reduced aircraft performance and B-29 defensive fire control systems. Even successful interceptions often cost irreplaceable experienced pilots who died when damaged or fuel-depleted fighters crashed attempting to return from extreme altitude. Major Makoto Ogawa, who eventually claimed 7 B-29 kills to become one of Japan's most successful Superfortress hunters, later described the overwhelming disadvantage Japanese pilots faced. American bombers flew in areas where Japanese aircraft barely functioned. Americans enjoyed pressurized cabins with heated compartments, while Japanese pilots endured temperatures 40 degrees below zero at high altitude, their fingers numb despite electrically heated flight suits that rarely worked properly. Oxygen systems frequently malfunctioned, leaving pilots hypoxic and disoriented. Gun barrels froze, ammunition belts jammed in cold, and engines ran so rough that pilots constantly feared flameouts. Japanese aircraft designers desperately sought solutions. The Nakajima Ki-87, developed specifically as a high-altitude B-29 interceptor, incorporated a turbo-supercharged Nakajima 219 engine intended to deliver effective performance above 30,000 ft. On paper, the design was impressive. Service ceiling above 40,000 ft, heavy armament of 30mm and 20mm cannon, and speed sufficient to overtake B-29 formations. Only one prototype flew before war's end in April 1945, demonstrating severe problems. The Turbocharger, cobbled together from inadequate materials with insufficient testing, failed repeatedly. Even when functioning, it delivered inconsistent performance. The project died not from lack of engineering skill, but from lack of industrial capacity to produce reliable turbochargers. The Tachikawa Ki-94, another proposed high-altitude interceptor, never progressed beyond mock-up stage. The Mitsubishi J-8M, a rocket-powered interceptor based on the German Mi-163 Comet, offered high-altitude capability without turbochargers. But dangerous rocket fuel and extremely short endurance made it impractical for defending against B-29 raids. Japan's finest aeronautical engineers understood what was needed, but lacked the industrial foundation to produce it. American B-29 operations expanded relentlessly. By November 1944, 21st Bomber Command began flying missions from Marana bases on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. These islands lay only 500 mi from Tokyo, well within B-29 range. Robert K. Morgan's mission on November 24th sent 111 Superfortresses against the Musashino aircraft engine plant in Tokyo. Weather and jet stream winds limited results, but the psychological impact on Japan was profound. American bombers now struck the homeland almost daily, and Japanese defenses proved increasingly ineffective. Sergeant Shoi Suzuki, an anti-aircraft gunner stationed near Tokyo, kept ADRI documenting growing despair among defenders. Initially, his unit engaged B-29 formations with confidence, their 75mm guns firing shells to altitudes around 25,000 ft. But American bombers often flew higher, beyond gun range or approached at angles giving gunners insufficient tracking time. More frustrating, even direct hits rarely brought down. B-29s, the bomber's structure built with redundant systems and armored in critical areas with toed damage that would have shredded Japanese aircraft. Suzuki recorded watching crippled B-29s, trailing smoke with engines shut down, continuing toward targets and often returning safely to base. Japanese efforts to improve air defenses focused on fighter performance modifications. The Kawasaki K-61 High-End, powered by aliquid-cooled HAR-40 engine, could reach altitudes around 32,000 ft higher than most Japanese fighters. But climb rate was insufficient and engine reliability so poor that many Ki-61s were grounded awaiting spare parts. The Nakajima 84. Hayata, introduced in 1944, represented Japan's best mass-produced fighter. It featured the Nakajima Homara engine, a complex radial design delivering good performance at altitude when properly maintained. However, the Homar's intricate construction made it maintenance-intensive, and quality control problems meant many engines failed prematurely. The Ki-84's theoretical performance was impressive. Maximum speed around 400 mph had 20,000 TU-FT, service ceiling near 35,000 ft, and heavy armament of 20 batimibi and 30 mm cannon. In practice, few Ki-84s achieved these specifications. Poor quality fuel, damaged engines, crude lubricants broke down at low temperatures, and manufacturing defects caused frequent failures. American pilots who test flew captured Ki-84s after the war praised handling and performance, noting it matched or exceeded American fighters in some respects. But they also observed that these captured examples had been selected for exceptional condition maintained by skilled Japanese mechanics using hoarded high-quality materials. The average operational Ki-84 performed far below design specifications. Even when Japanese fighters reached B-29 operating altitudes, they faced the bomber's sophisticated defensive armament. Each Superfortress mounted 1050 caliber machine guns and remote controlled turrets. A central fire control system allowed gunners to coordinate fire, concentrating multiple turrets on single targets. The system incorporated computing sites automatically calculating lead and deflection, significantly improving hit probability. Japanese pilots soon discovered that closing to effective gun range of a B-29 formation meant flying through coordinated barrages from which few returned. The psychological toll on Japanese aviators was immense. They had been taught to believe in the superiority of Japanese air power and the invincibility of the Bushido spirit over technological advantage. The brutal reality of combat against the B-29s shattered those convictions. Captain Yasuhiko Kuroi, a veteran pilot of the 302nd Air Group, wrote in a letter found after the war that engaging B-29s felt like assaulting a fortress. The bombers absorbed punishment that would have destroyed a dozen Japanese planes, their crews protected by armor plating and redundant systems, while Japanese pilots flew unarmored, fighters with exposed fuel tanks and almost no protection. December 1944 marked the first major daylight assault on Tokyo when 86 B-29 struck the Musashino aircraft plant. Japanese defenses managed to shoot down or cripple several bombers, but at a terrible price. The 234th Sentai, led by Captain Kobayashi, claimed 6 B-29s destroyed through desperate ramming attacks, but lost many irreplaceable pilots in return. Ramming grew increasingly frequent as Japanese pilots realized that conventional attacks often failed to bring down the enormous bombers. The method was suicidal. Pilots aimed their fighters at the B-29's wings or tail sections, hoping to sever control surfaces, then tried to bail out before impact. Few succeeded. American crews respected the fierce bravery of Japanese pilots even as they were horrified by the needless loss of life. Technical Sergeant John McLaughlin, a gunner aboard City of Los Angeles, later recalled watching a Japanese fighter deliberately ram the B-29 flying beside him. The attacker struck the bomber's tail, shearing off its entire vertical stabilizer. Both aircraft spiraled out of formation, spinning uncontrollably. McLaughlin saw no parachutes. He later learned that all 10 men aboard the B-29 perished. The Japanese pilot's name was never recorded, one among thousands who died defending their homeland against an enemy they could not defeat. By early 1945, Japan's air defenses were nearing total collapse. Fuel shortages grounded many remaining fighters. Veteran pilots had been lost in staggering numbers, replaced by teenagers with minimal training who stood no chance against experienced B-29 crews. American P-51 Mustang escorts, flying from Iwo Jima after its capture in March 1945, made defending against B-29 raids even more futile. Japanese interceptors climbing laboriously to altitude became easy prey for P-51s, which could outclimb, outrun, and outfight any Japanese aircraft. The night of March 9-10, 1945 brought the greatest catastrophe in Japan's history. General Curtis LeMay, commander of the 21st Bomber Command, ordered a radical change in tactics. Instead of precision strikes from high altitude, 334 B-29s would attack Tokyo at night from around 7,000 feet, carrying incendiary bombs designed to ignite massive fires. The decision was controversial. Flying lower exposed the bombers to heavier anti-aircraft fire, but LeMay correctly judged that Japan's night defenses were weak. Lower altitude also reduced turbocharger strain, prevented engine overheating, and allowed each B-29 to carry far heavier bomb loads. The results exceeded all expectations. In 3 hours, American bombers dropped nearly 2,000 tons of incendiaries over Tokyo's crowded districts. Firestorms erupted, generating hurricane force, winds that drew oxygen from shelters and produced temperatures above 100 degrees. An estimated 100,000 people were killed, more than either atomic bombing would later cause. 16 square miles of the city were reduced to ashes. Only 14 B-29s were lost, an astonishingly small number given the scale of the raid. The firebombing of Tokyo proved that even without exploiting its high-altitude capabilities, the B-29 could utterly devastate Japan. Yet it was the Turbo-Superchargers that had made the B-29 fleet possible. Without the ability to operate at extreme altitudes, to soar above weather and beyond the reach of fighters, the strategic bombing campaign could not have been sustained. Missions from China across vast distances to Kyushu required efficient high-altitude performance. Daylight precision attacks on aircraft plants and oil refineries demanded the protection altitude afforded. Even low-level incendiary raids were only possible because American air superiority, 1. through earlier high-altitude operations that crippled Japan's fighter, production had already been achieved. Japanese engineers, who examined captured B-29 components after the war, expressed bitter admiration for the sophistication of American engineering. Turbochargers represented everything Japan's industry lacked: precision manufacturing, advanced materials, rigorous quality control, and capacity to produce thousands of complex units monthly. A single B-29 contained 8 turbochargers. American production exceeded 200 B-29s monthly by 1945, meaning 1,600 turbochargers monthly just for new aircraft, plus thousands more for replacements and maintenance. General Electric's factories produced these at rates Japan could not have achieved if devoting its entire aircraft engine industry solely to turbocharger production. The broader implications were clear to thoughtful Japanese observers. If America could produce turbochargers in such quantities, what else could it produce? The answer was evident in waves of B-29s appearing over Japan almost daily by summer 1945. In P-51's escorts that destroyed Japanese fighters with ease, in naval forces that blockaded Japan completely, in atomic bombs that fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. First Lieutenant Toshio Ott, a technical intelligence officer who survived the war, later wrote that examining captured American aviation technology induced despair among Japanese engineers. Every system, every component demonstrated manufacturing quality and engineering sophistication beyond Japanese capabilities. Turbochargers particularly impressed him because their operation was conceptually simple. Yet execution required precision that Japan's war-damaged industry could no longer achieve. Even had Japan somehow obtained turbocharger designs in 1941, he concluded it lacked the industrial base to produce them in useful quantities. The human cost of this technological gap was staggering. Japanese pilot training programs, Once-Rigoris and producing superb aviators, had collapsed by 1945. Fuel shortages meant student pilots received perhaps 50 hours of flight training compared to 200 to 300 hours American pilots received. These inadequately trained pilots flew obsolescent aircraft against opponents who enjoyed every advantage. In July 1945, during a major battle over the inland sea, Japanese fighters attacked a formation of over 100 B-29s. American records show perhaps 2 bombers damaged, while Japanese forces lost 23 fighters destroyed with minimal damage inflicted on bombers. The B-29 campaign ultimately delivered 147,000 tons of bombs on Japanese targets, destroyed 40% of urban industrial areas in 66 cities, and killed an estimated 330,000 civilians. Japanese war production, already declining, collapsed completely by summer 1945. Transportation networks were destroyed, making it impossible to move resources even where they existed. Workers abandoned factories to flee burning cities. The government lost control of economic planning as industries dispersed into rural areas or ceased operation. Major General Aris Suer-Sizo, chief of Japanese military intelligence, admitted after the war that by June 1945, his analysts recognized defeat was inevitable. American air supremacy was absolute. The B-29 campaign had destroyed Japan's ability to wage war. Yet the government, trapped by military honor codes forbidding surrender, continued fighting until atomic bombs provided justification for capitulation. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th, 1945, marked the end of World War II. Those atomic bombs were delivered by B-29s, aircraft whose ability to reach targets in Japan and return safely depended fundamentally on Turbo-Supercharger technology. The Enola Gay, flying at 31,000 feet over Hiroshima, operated at altitude made possible by 8 General Electric turbochargers maintaining engine power in thin air. Even at war's end, with Japanese defenses essentially non-existent, altitude capability provided by turbochargers offered protection against remaining anti-aircraft fire and allowed crews to escape atomic blast effects. Post-war interviews with Japanese fighter pilots revealed a consistent theme: admiration mixed with frustration. They respected American engineering and recognized that no amount of pilot skill could overcome technological disadvantage. Lieutenant Isamu Sasaki, who survived the war with 3 B-29 kills, one of the highest tallies achieved, later reflected that his successes came only when circumstances were perfect. Surprise attack from above with sun behind him against isolated bombers separated from formations. Against formations flying at altitude with alert crews, even the best Japanese pilots rarely succeeded. The development of high-altitude aviation capability had been pursued by many nations before World War II. Germany developed turbo-superchargers, but never successfully deployed them operationally, focusing instead on mechanical superchargers, which were simpler but less efficient at extreme altitude. Britain relied primarily on sophisticated, multi-stage mechanical superchargers providing good high-altitude performance without turbocharging complexity. America alone made turbo-supercharging standard equipment on heavy bombers, accepting additional complexity, cost, and maintenance burden in return for unprecedented high-altitude capability. This decision reflected American industrial confidence. Turbo-superchargers required precision manufacturing, regular maintenance by skilled mechanics, and steady supply of spare parts. America possessed the infrastructure to support these requirements. Japan did not, even if Japanese engineers had designed perfect turbochargers in 1941. The nation lacked manufacturing base to produce them in quantity, maintenance organization to keep them functioning, and supply system to provide necessary spare parts and replacement units. The post-war U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey concluded that the B-29 campaign was decisively effective in destroying Japan's capacity to wage war. While survey authors debated whether Japan would have surrendered without atomic bombs or planned invasion, they unanimously agreed that by August 1945, American air supremacy was complete and Japanese defenses were shattered. The B-29's technological advantages, particularly high-altitude capability enabled by turbo-superchargers, made this outcome inevitable once sufficient bombers became available. Japanese records captured after the war revealed the extent to which B-29 raids dominated military planning from late 1944 onward. Imperial General Headquarters devoted enormous resources to air defense, pulling fighter units from other theaters, constructing thousands of anti-aircraft positions, and training tens of thousands of troops for airfield defense. All efforts proved futile against bombers operating beyond effective defensive reach. The final B-29 mission against Japan flew on August 14, 1945, the day before surrender was announced. More than 300 superfortresses attacked targets near Tokyo, encountering no opposition. Japanese fighters remained on the ground, conserving fuel for the expected American invasion that would never come. B-29 crews returned to their Marana bases, not yet knowing the war was effectively over. Their missions completed through cumulative destruction of hundreds of raids Japan could not prevent or effectively counter. In decades following the war, aviation historians and aeronautical engineers conducted extensive analyses of B-29 technological advantages. The consensus was clear. Turbo-supercharging provided fundamental capability that made strategic bombing of Japan possible from remote bases. Without this technology, B-29s would have been limited to operations at altitudes around 20,000 Ft, well within range of Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft guns. Losses would have been unsustainable. The entire strategic concept of bombing Japan from Mariana bases would have been impractical. The insights Japanese engineers gained from studying American aviation technology profoundly shaped Japan's post-war industrial revival. The focus on precision production, rigorous quality assurance, and systematic engineering that defined American turbo-supercharger manufacturing became trademarks of Japan's post-war economic resurgence. Many former aviation engineers transitioned into civilian industries, bringing with them hard-earned knowledge of advanced manufacturing practices. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress flew its final combat sortie in 1954 during the Korean War. By that time, jet-powered bombers were replacing propeller-driven aircraft, and turbo-supercharging for piston engines had become a relic of an earlier age. Yet the B-29's legacy endured. It proved that technological excellence could offset numerical inferiority, that industrial strength was as vital as individual bravery, and that air power alone could cripple a nation's capacity to wage war. Today, only 2 B-29s remain flight-worthy, preserved and operated by dedicated organizations ensuring future generations can witness these historic aircraft in motion. When these bombers take to the skies at air shows, their Wright R-3350 engines producing that deep, throaty resonance, few in the crowd realize that hidden within each engine nacelle are turbo-superchargers, survivors of the technology that helped end the most destructive conflict in history. Those components, still spinning at thousands of revolutions per minute as the B-29s climb skyward, continue to perform the same task they were built for 8 decades ago, compressing thin air to maintain engine power at altitude. The story of Japanese forces confronting B-29 Superfortresses ultimately illustrates how industrial strength and technological progress dictated the outcomes of modern warfare. The turbo-superchargers that enabled the B-29s to operate at 30,000 feet, the production systems that manufactured thousands of these intricate devices, the training programs that prepared crews to use them effectively, and the logistics networks that kept them functioning. All these were the true weapons of the strategic bombing campaign. The B-29's technological advantage did not guarantee victory for the United States from the outset of the war. But once American industry mobilized, once B-29 production reached full capacity, and once the Mariana air bases became operational, Japan's defeat became inevitable. No measure of pilot skill, no degree of sacrifice, could overcome the material and technological dominance embodied in those gleaming bombers that roared above at altitudes where Japanese fighters gasped for air. When the B-29s cruised at 30,000 feet over Japan, their turbochargers humming quietly within their engines, sustaining sea-level power in the stratosphere, they carried more than bombs. They carried proof that industrial might had become the ultimate weapon of modern war, and that America possessed it in quantities no adversary could match. Japan had never anticipated such a reality, and once the silver bombers filled the skies above the home islands, flying beyond the reach of defense, there was nothing Japan could do to stop them.